Attention Britain! Quick before we go deeper, I'm George, and at Dan Bam we don't deal in palace headlines, we follow the details. Prince William and Catherine have reportedly made a decision about Camilla's future that Charles never expected to hear from his own son. And when the king understood what they were proposing, he didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply sat there in silence, because this wasn't really about a title, an old family disagreement, or another private palace dispute. William and Catherine were drawing a line around the next reign, and Camilla was standing on the other side of it. The meeting reportedly took place at Windsor Castle on Thursday, August the 13th, 2026, at 6:25 in the evening. Charles had been told it concerned future transition arrangements, the kind of phrase that normally means staffing, schedules, continuity, and administrative planning, nothing that would suggest a confrontation. But when Charles entered the private sitting room, William and Catherine were already waiting. Between them sat a cream-coloured folder. Across the front were 4 words, "The Next Reign Household." Charles sat down and looked from William to Catherine. William didn't open the folder. Catherine did. That small movement immediately changed the atmosphere because it showed Charles that this wasn't simply William's decision. Catherine was involved too. When Charles began reading the first page, the future he had quietly assumed for Camilla began to look very different. There was no attack on Camilla, no demand that she disappear, no criticism of her marriage or her years of service. The wording was far more administrative, and that made it even more significant. One sovereign, one working household, one centre of royal authority when the next reign begins. At first it sounded like ordinary palace planning. Then the consequence became clear. If Charles were to die before Camilla, there would be no automatic second royal court built around his widow, no guaranteed communications office, no permanent institutional staff simply because those staff had served the previous reign, no assumption that Clarence House would automatically continue as a separate royal headquarters. Camilla could remain family. She could retain her lawful status, her dignity, her personal interests, and her charitable work. But William and Catherine were making one thing unmistakable. The monarchy after Charles would belong to the next king and queen. And according to the proposal, the idea had not started with William alone. Several days earlier at Kensington Palace, Catherine had been reviewing historical royal transitions when she reached the events of 1952. King George VI died at Sandringham. Princess Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth II, and his widow became Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother went on to become one of Britain's most recognisable royal figures, maintaining a household, staff, engagements, patronages, and a major public presence for decades. Catherine reportedly read that history carefully and then focused on one question. Would the same model automatically apply to Camilla? The answer was complicated. A surviving consort could continue public work, retain ceremonial visibility, and remain surrounded by an established network of staff and advisors. But Catherine saw something beyond the individual duties. A royal household is not simply a group of employees. It includes advisors, communications teams, scheduling operations, invitations, briefings, patronages, and sometimes a residence from which public influence continues. Individually, those things can appear harmless. Together, they can create something much larger, a second centre of royal gravity beside the new sovereign. And that was what concerned Catherine. The Queen Mother model had existed inside a very different family structure. Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was the new Queen's mother. Camilla would be William's stepmother, while Catherine herself would become Queen. Different relationships, different history, different pressures. Catherine then reportedly asked William a question that changed the entire discussion. Were they actually preparing their own reign, or were they simply inheriting assumptions created for previous generations? William understood the danger immediately. Any decision limiting Camilla's future institutional role could easily be portrayed as revenge. Diana's name would inevitably return. William could be accused of settling an old family score. Catherine could be accused of using her future position to push Camilla aside. William wanted to avoid that completely. Then Catherine suggested something that removed the easiest criticism. If the rule looked personal, make it apply to her too. William reportedly stopped and considered what she meant. Catherine was serious. If William died before her and George became king, she would not expect her son to build a second court around his mother. No separate Catherine household carrying institutional authority beside George's reign. No automatic communications operation. No inherited staff structure. No permanent royal influence simply because she had once been queen. She would remain George's mother. She would retain her dignity. She could continue causes that mattered to her. But the machinery of the monarchy would belong to George. That changed everything. The argument was no longer simply about Camilla. It became a principle. William then asked advisors to examine the idea from every possible direction. What would happen to communication staff? What about existing offices? Which patronages belonged personally to a royal and which depended on the crown? Could a former consort continue appearing publicly without creating confusion about who actually represented the sovereign? Could a residence associated with a previous reign quietly become a second royal headquarters? The answers were complicated. A transition decided during grief could easily become emotional and rushed. A transition planned years in advance could be built around rules rather than personalities. William still understood the danger. His mother's name would be dragged into the debate, whether he mentioned Diana or not. Any restriction on Camilla could easily become a story about the past, and Catherine reportedly anticipated that. Her solution was to make the principle uncomfortable enough to be credible. If she was willing to accept the same limits herself, then it could not honestly be described as a punishment aimed specifically at Camilla. From there, the wording reportedly became tighter. No reference to Diana. No criticism of Charles. No direct attack on Camilla. No language about removal or humiliation. The rule had to be strong enough to change the structure, but neutral enough to survive accusations of revenge. Then someone raised the question everyone had been avoiding. Clarence House. The room changed. Clarence House was not simply another royal address. It had become deeply associated with the Queen Mother, who lived there for decades after the death of George VI. Charles had grown up seeing his grandmother remain visible, respected, and influential within the monarchy long after her husband's reign had ended. For Charles, Clarence House represented continuity. It showed that a widow could remain important without challenging the sovereign. Camilla already had her own association with the residence, so if William and Catherine were serious about creating one working household, they would have to decide whether that principle extended beyond staff and communications to the residence itself. That was when William understood that Charles needed to hear the proposal directly. A private meeting was arranged at Windsor Castle for Thursday evening. The description sent ahead remained restrained. Future transition arrangements. Charles was not given a reason to expect anything explosive. William wanted his father to hear the principle before anyone else could interpret it for him. By 6:31 that evening, Charles had reached the end of the first page. He looked up slowly. The room no longer felt like a routine meeting about future planning. William sat opposite him with his hands folded, while Catherine had the folder open in front of her. Charles had read enough to understand the direction, but not enough to accept what it meant. His first reaction reportedly was not anger, it was disbelief. He asked whether this was really about Camilla. William answered carefully that it affected Camilla. Charles saw no difference. Catherine did. The proposal was not about removing Camilla. It was about preventing any previous royal household from automatically carrying institutional authority into the next reign. Then Charles asked the question William knew was coming. What happens to Clarence House? Nobody answered immediately. That pause carried decades of history. Charles remembered what the Queen Mother's household had represented. A former royal figure could remain visible, active, respected, and surrounded by an established structure. But William's answer was blunt. Nothing would be automatic. Not the house, not the office, not the staff, not the institutional role. Charles leaned back. Then the conversation became painfully personal. What happens if I'm not here to protect her? William's expression softened, but his answer did not. She won't need protection from us. Charles asked what he should call this proposal. William reportedly answered with one word: a boundary. Silence followed. Charles had spent decades waiting for the crown, and now his son was asking him to imagine the day when that crown had already passed on. He was being forced to picture Camilla alive and well inside a monarchy that no longer belonged to their household. Then Charles turned toward Catherine. Until that point, William had carried most of the explanation. Charles seemed to expect Catherine to remain supportive but quiet. Instead, she moved the argument somewhere he had not anticipated. It applies to me too. Charles stared at her. Catherine explained that if William died first and George became king, she would accept exactly the same principle. She would not expect George to preserve a separate court around his mother simply because she had once been queen. She would not expect William's staff to automatically become hers. She would not demand a permanent institutional voice beside her son's throne. Then Catherine reportedly delivered the sentence that stopped the room. "My son should never have to inherit my authority as well as his father's crown." Charles looked down at the folder and said nothing. No explosion, no dramatic rejection, just silence. Because Catherine had removed the strongest argument against the proposal, she was willing to accept the same limitation herself. The rule was no longer about Camilla alone, it was a principle designed to apply across generations. But the woman most directly affected still had not heard it. Charles eventually asked that Camilla be brought into the conversation. At around 7:10, Camilla entered the room and immediately sensed that something had shifted. Charles was no longer reading. William sat forward, controlled but tense. Catherine remained beside the open folder. Camilla looked first at Charles, then at William and Catherine. William asked her to sit and explained that he and Catherine had decided how their household would operate when the next reign eventually began. There would be one sovereign at the center of the institution, supported by one principal working household. Other members of the family could remain active, respected, and visible. But no second court would continue automatically beside the new king. Camilla understood the implication almost immediately. She asked whether that meant William's household would replace hers. William corrected the assumption. It was not about his household, it was about the king's household. Whoever wore the crown would control the institution attached to it. Camilla then asked what that meant for her. Catherine answered first. "You remain family." Camilla wanted to know whether she would still have a royal role. Catherine clarified that the proposal did not erase Camilla's lawful status or dignity. She could continue charitable interests, attend family occasions, and appear publicly when invited by the sovereign. But the automatic machinery would end. Staff would serve the reigning household. Communications would come through the new court. Official representation would depend on the sovereign's invitation. Residences connected to royal work would be reviewed, rather than automatically inherited through precedent. Nothing was being seized, but nothing was being guaranteed either. Camilla reportedly asked whether that meant she would disappear after Charles. William said no. Losing automatic institutional authority was not the same as disappearing. A former queen could remain part of national life without operating a separate court beside the sovereign. Then came the phrase that brought the entire proposal into focus. Family is not the same as government. Camilla's years of service beside Charles would not be erased, but the structure supporting those years would not automatically survive Charles's reign. Catherine then explained that she would face exactly the same future. If William died first and George became king, she would not ask him to preserve a separate Catherine household. No independent court, no inherited command over staff, no permanent institutional voice beside George simply because she had once been queen. That appeared to change the atmosphere. The rule was no longer something imposed on one woman. It was a principle designed for everyone who came after. The second page of the document reportedly made that even clearer. The principle would apply to future surviving consorts as well. Catherine was included. Future spouses of George would be covered. The structure was intended to survive the people currently sitting around the table. When one reign ended, the institutional household would end with it. A new sovereign could invite a former consort to continue public duties, selected patronages, major ceremonial appearances, or charitable work. But none of those roles would continue simply because they existed before. Authority would have to be renewed. William had also reportedly discussed the principle with Princess Anne. Anne understood the Queen Mother model better than almost anyone. She had watched one reign end and another begin, and she had witnessed how the Queen Mother remained a major public figure for decades. William wanted to know whether ending that model would weaken continuity. Anne's reported answer was simple: different reign, different family. When William asked whether the next king should be allowed to establish his own household, Anne's position was equally direct. The next king had to be allowed to be king. That distinction gave William something he needed. The idea could now be presented as institutional reform rather than personal revenge. Back at Windsor, Charles began to see the bigger picture. The question was no longer whether Camilla deserved respect after his reign. Of course she did. The real question was whether any former consort should automatically carry an independent institution into the reign of the next sovereign. William's answer was no. A sovereign could always choose to involve a former consort, but precedent would not force that choice. Charles eventually closed the folder. The meeting began to end, but before everyone left, Charles asked William to stay behind. Once they were alone, Charles asked whether William had truly considered what the rule could mean for Catherine. William answered immediately, every day. Charles pushed further. Could William really accept a future where Catherine stepped away from the machinery of the crown? His answer was reportedly no, but Catherine had accepted the principle because she understood the cost. She wasn't asking anyone to make a sacrifice she wouldn't make herself. When George became sovereign, she believed his reign should belong entirely to him. That was why William supported the proposal. On Friday, August 14th, William and Catherine reportedly reviewed the final wording. It was deliberately neutral. No mention of Diana, no criticism of Charles, no attack on Camilla, and no language of punishment. Just one principle: one sovereign, one court, and one working household. William signed. Catherine signed beside him. There was no celebration because both understood that the same rule could eventually limit their own futures. Camilla could remain Charles's widow, continue her causes, and appear at events, but she would not automatically carry Charles's institutional structure into William's reign, and Catherine had accepted that same future for herself. That detail changes everything. If William died first, Catherine's popularity and history would not automatically justify a second court beside George. The principle would remain: one reign, one sovereign, one household. Charles had entered Windsor expecting a discussion about staffing and transition. He left having been forced to imagine the monarchy after him and a future where Camilla's institutional position depended entirely on the next sovereign. But one major question remains: Clarence House. If there is truly only one royal household, who controls it when the next reign begins? That answer could determine whether this principle remains hidden in palace files or becomes the clearest break yet with the Queen Mother era. If you come to Dan Bam for detail-driven royal analysis, like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. Because the next chapter may be even more important than the decision itself.